Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. Recently I have been assembling and painting miniatures for the Elder Scrolls Call to Arms from Modiphius, and people may have seen me mention in the comments to some of my videos that the miniatures are a bit of a pain to put together. They are chopped up into a lot of pieces and don't go together as well as I would like, especially as they are monopose miniatures. They don't have a lot of customization to them. So I thought I would do a quick video just showing the assembly for the Dragonborn miniature from the Bleak Falls Barrows Delve set. Before that, I did just want to say that the end result for these miniatures is good. I'm happy with the miniatures that I have painted up so far. If you haven't seen the videos where I've done painting guides, I've put together some skeletons. Here's one of them. And yeah, it was a pain to put together, but I think it looks really nice. And they are screen accurate. They've done a good job capturing the feel of the Skyrim characters. I think the Drago are particularly nice. Sometimes the detailing is a little bit soft on these miniatures. This miniature is particularly interesting because it was cast in a clear resin and came in a grand total of 2 parts. There was the main body and then there was the shield, which you glued on separately, and that seemed perfectly acceptable to me. But it is a very strange contrast to the plastic Dragonborn miniature from the Delve set, which has a total of 12 pieces plus the base. It has been chopped up to the nth degree, and to put that in context, this big old chap from Blackstone Fortress Deadly Alliance, the Zote, is 14 pieces. So this is only 2 more pieces than a human-sized Dragonborn miniature. So here are the instructions for assembling the Dragonborn, and they're pretty standard for the kind of instructions you get from a lot of companies, but it is worth noting that the numbering of the parts does not represent the order in which you're going to want to put these together. For example, this arm K11 is going to be sandwiched between the front and back parts of the body by the looks of it, so you would definitely want to put that in before putting the front on. And just looking at those instructions, you can see it seems like there's more parts to this kit than there potentially needs to be. And here is the kit on the frame. 12 parts in total and some quite fiddly parts. And they've even done things like, we've got the shield and then we've got the shield arm separate. I'm pretty sure that could have been sculpted as a single piece. So we're going to start cutting these components out of the frame, and I'm not going to cut them all out at once because I don't want to get confused as to which part is which, especially with some of these small, slightly random chunks that they've got here. It could be easy to mix those up. So I'm going to cut them out as I use them. And for this construction, I will be using plastic glue. Plastic glue will melt the plastic ever so slightly. It will form a stronger bond, but it also gives you more play when you're putting the kit together. So if you put 2 components together and then realize you need to do things in a slightly different order, you do have a little bit of wiggle room to separate parts and rearrange parts. Unlike superglue, where generally speaking, once it's in, it's in. So as I'm cutting these parts out, I'm cutting them as close as possible to the components without actually cutting the components themselves. And then when there's little nubs like this, I'm just going to clean those up with a mold line remover and a craft knife. Here I am removing the front and back sections of the torso, the main trunk of the miniature, and I'm just going around carefully cutting all of the connector points. And some of the connection points are in awkward places, so you just need to be careful with that. And then I'm doing some dry fits here, and I found dry fitting was essential with this kit because it was quite confusing how it all went together. So I've just pressed the front and back together, and I'm taking a look at the arm joints and the leg joints, and you can see there's no connectors. There's just these open areas where the arms will attach. And you can see that the front and back sections do sandwich that sword arm in place. And now I'm just looking at the other joints and trying to figure out whether those will also sandwich the joints. And as it turns out, only the sword arm gets sandwiched between the two halves of the torso. The other limbs can just push in. And now I'm trying to figure out the furs on the miniature. There's a very unusual cut here where it just has like a little triangular piece that just sits on. It's very unusual. But it will just go on like that. Again, nothing to clip it in or anything, you just need to glue it on. And this was the point where I realised I was going to have to cut out all of the components, because the way they go together is quite unusual, and the way they overlap and overlay and sit on top of each other, it just became easier to have all of the components laid out in front of me so I could constantly do dry fits and work out how I was going to do it. So I've laid them out on the table here in roughly the sequence that I think I need to glue them together. So I'm starting with the shield. The shield actually has a little indent in it, which shows where the arm goes. So I'm just applying a very small amount of glue, and it needs to be a small amount here because I don't want it to squash out of the sides and ruin any of the detailing on the back side of the shield. And I must say, these two pieces did go together very nicely. The fit is quite exact, and the way there's an imprint on the shield means you can't really get that wrong. Next up, I'm going to glue the two halves of the torso together, the main trunk of the miniature, and this is why I think plastic glue is important here, because you kind of need to apply the glue to the body, get it together, and then pull it apart slightly, just wiggle the sword arm in, and then press the two parts back together. Fortunately, the other limbs don't need to be sandwiched in that way. Next up, I'm going to attach one of the legs, and it just sort of sits up inside the recess on the bottom of the miniature, and in that way it does do quite a good job of hiding the cuts. This was the point where I was thinking, do I need to attach the shield? I wasn't entirely sure whether it needed to be sandwiched in or not, and it doesn't. And at this point I also realised that it's not a good idea to attach the shield, because the angle of the shield puts it right close to the body, and that's going to be very difficult to paint. So this is the point where I thought it's probably best to leave that off. So I moved on to the shoulder plate instead. And this, again, it just sits on the top. It's very fiddly, very small. But again, I was very impressed that once it actually sat on top of the arm, you can't really see any join there. I'm not entirely sure it needed to be a separate piece, but I was quite impressed with how it went together. Next we have the most fiddly part, and that is the front of the head. This is something that I've seen on a few of these Elder Scrolls miniatures where they have sliced the face off. And I believe this is something that used to happen quite a lot with the Kingdom Death monster miniatures as well, and it's annoying because you have to deal with a tiny little face. We now have the other leg, which is in two parts, and again, I'm not entirely sure it's necessary to be in two parts, but there we go. So I was just dry fitting it, which I did constantly whilst doing this build, more so than I would normally expect to do for a miniature of this size. And then it just sort of fits in here, and I had some real difficulty getting this to fit at first. It only goes one way, and I couldn't get it to fit quite right until I realised, I looked at the miniature on the box, and I realised that the Dragonborn is rolling her hip, so her forward leg is actually slightly across her body, and I was trying to put it in a more open stance with the leg moved outwards rather than moved inwards. It felt a little bit unnatural that the leg would be slightly crossing the front of the movement of the miniature, but that's how they've done it, like she's rolling, perhaps ducking into a swing, and you'll see that more when I show you the miniature assembled facing the front of the camera in a moment. Finally, I'm sticking on the sheath here, which just fits into a little groove on the side. And you can see here what I mean about that forward leg. It sort of cuts across the miniature slightly. Not a lot, but it just moves across the central line of the miniature, whereas I was expecting it to move outwards more. Once I had that figured out, it did go together quite well. And like I've said before, I was quite impressed with how this miniature hid all of the joints. It was a bit of a pain to put together, but all of the joints are pretty well hidden, although that is easier with a miniature that has all these layers and different layers of armor and fur to hide those connecting points. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm just doing a final check on the shield to make sure it's still going to fit, and also to confirm in my own mind that I don't need to attach it yet. And here it is compared to that resin miniature that I showed you before. And as you can see, the stances are very similar, yet the resin miniature was 2 pieces and went together in seconds, and the other plastic miniature was in 12 pieces and was a pain, and the end result is very, very similar. So I think this is something that Modiphius might need to address going forward. With an IP like Elder Scrolls, they're going to get a lot of attention from people who might not want to deal with 12-part assembly miniatures. So I really do think this is something that they might need to address going forwards. But anyway, that is it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you have liked the video, please consider pressing that like button. If you have really enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I'll see you all again very soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.